Welcome everyone. My name is Stephanie Ivick. I'm the Content Marketing Manager here at eLearning Brothers. Today we are going to be talking about storytelling. We've got a great webinar planned for you, and we are recording this. You'll receive an email after the webinar with a copy of the recording. We'll also be posting it on our blog, so keep your eyes open for that. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to put them in the questions panel. We'll be answering them throughout the webinar. We'll try to get to all of them out loud. If we can't, we'll follow up with you afterwards. We have the raise of hands feature as well. I think Andrew might be doing that for some engagement things today. So without further ado, we have Andrew Townsend, our campaign marketing manager and resident film expert. We are very excited to hear what he has to share. So let's get to it, Andrew.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks everybody for joining. This is a slightly modified but repeat webinar that we did last December. I don't know if any of you were with us then and were able to watch that one, but it's something that comes up pretty often, so we figured we would launch this one again since it's been a year and people have probably forgotten about that one. Also, last year we had Katie and Jonica on. That's two of our amazing custom developers. They were not able to attend this year because they are developing custom projects. They're out there doing what they talked about, making great stories through e-learning. I'm going to be quoting a lot of different experts. One of them that we'll bring up quite a bit is Ray Jimenez. So the reason I'm mentioning, sorry, not Jimenez, Jimenez, I should have pronounced that correctly. He was speaking at DevLearn in 2019. And he gave a presentation called How to Use Stories to Engage Learners. And it was a really fun session, but it got me thinking. My background is in film and marketing for using film. I did freelance work for a long time after school, studied film at school, and it's been fun to come into e-learning and see how important story can be and how useful story can be as an e-learning tool. And that's what got me talking about Katie and Jonica, some of our developers and designers about this and moving into this. So that's the direction we're going to be coming in. As some of you saw in the webinar description, we are going to be talking about some movies. And so I want to give you this out of courtesy. There are going to be spoilers, movie spoilers. However, they're all older movies. The first one being Star Wars from 1977. We're going to be covering that in its entirety. That's the one movie that we're really going to zoom in and focus on because it's been out for 43 years and it's one of the most watched movies of all time. So I hope that we don't ruin Star Wars for anybody. We're also going to mention Lord of the Rings, the Avengers movies, Rocky, Ford vs. Ferrari, and Ender's Game, and a couple other things that are either movies or stories or both, or books. All right, so to jump in, stories are a communal currency of humanity. This is a quote from the Arabian Nights. The English edition of that book was published in 1706, but the book, the stories of the Arabian Nights go back way before 1706, because humans communicate in story. They communicate through story. We tell stories to communicate, and we value those stories. If anybody has read the Arabian Nights or knows about the Arabian Nights, it's about the general overall. I mean, there's a bunch of smaller stories, but the overarching story is that there's a woman who is paying for her life in stories. There's a king that wants to put her to death. I can't remember why. I didn't reread it right before this webinar. I apologize. But she says, I'm going to tell you a story if you let me live one more day. And she uses those stories as currency to buy her life. In his paper, Knowledge and Memory, The Real Story, Dr. Roger C. Schenck says, virtually all human knowledge is based on stories constructed around past experiences. So think about that. All of your knowledge is based on stories in your mind constructed around past experiences. If you lose your keys, or if you're like me and you lose your wallet, which recently happened to me, if you lose your keys and you're going, okay, where did I lose those keys? Where do I remember having them last? And then you walk through the story of your life. That's how you remember. You remember through stories. And there's, because of that, there's very high value in story. Next quote here from Ira Glass: great stories happen to those who can tell them. I'm going to tell you a story to iterate this point. We, long before the pandemic, would have a lunch in the break room here at eLearning Brothers with several of us, and we would play games. We play board games. We play a lot of board games. But I would often come in and tell a story, some story about my home life, usually something stupid I did around my wife or to my wife, something stupid I said or did. And it was usually funny, and people loved hearing these stories. And I had one coworker, Josh, who said, buddy, I don't know how you're still married, because it sounds like you are a terrible husband. Everything you tell us is so bad. You're such a terrible spouse. And I said, well, the only stories I'm telling you are the ones with conflict. The only stories I'm telling you are the ones that are interesting, and the way they're interesting is they have conflict. If I was going to tell you a story, hey, I went home and I thought about my wife, and I went, oh, you know what, I should pick up some chocolates on the way home because she likes chocolates. And then I went and bought them and I gave them to her, and she said, oh my goodness, thank you so much. Boring. Okay. It's not memorable. There's nothing to hold on to. It's about conflict. And as we talked more and more about that, he said, well, I don't like to remember negative. And I've had this conversation with lots of other people, that you have to have conflict in order for a story to be interesting. Unique and novel experiences are more memorable, and if they have conflict, they are even more memorable. The mundane is often forgotten. So how do you add interest to those mundane stories? And one way is to bring out the emotion, to make the emotion a form of tension. If I wanted to tell that I was driving home and needed to get that chocolate for my wife, and I wanted to figure out how to make that more intense, you bring in the emotion, because emotion adds a complexity there. But I want to come back to this quote from Ira Glass. You have to start telling stories before you get good at it. If you don't think you're good at stories, or you find that you're often telling stories and people's eyes glass over and they're like, and they're not remembering it, you have to keep trying, and you'll get better at telling these stories. And then eventually great stories will start to happen, because you'll start to be good at telling them, and then it'll be easier for you to come up with stories. To quote Jake from Adventure Time, a Cartoon Network cartoon, dude, sucking at something is the first step towards being sort of good at something. So that's you can take that quote and pin it on the wall. The last quote for this little introduction section: the human species thinks in metaphors and learns through stories. From Roger Schenck, our memory of factual events can only be remembered by a story, coming back to that quote from Roger Schenck again. So, there's that retrace your steps tool to help you remember, right, through the story. But then when we hear a story, we think in the metaphor. How does that story apply to me via metaphor? So that's why you want to use a story, because we're actually thinking in that metaphor. What's happening on the screen with Frodo is just like my experience here, and therefore I am learning from watching Frodo from Lord of the Rings, and I can apply it to myself here. So I'll continue to tell more stories. I've already told a lot of stories in this session, and hopefully you guys are able to learn and remember something by the stories that I tell you. So
I think one thing we're all going to learn is that you need to buy your wife some chocolates now.
Shush, she's probably on this.
Exactly. So now she knows that you've been thinking about getting her chocolates. She's going to be expecting them.
Sweetheart, I'm going to be home late tonight. I got to pick up chocolates, apparently. Okay, so here's the 5 keys. If you need to leave right now, here's the end of the webinar. Here's our 5 keys. This is what you came to get. 1, don't let story become an afterthought. 2, tell a good story. 3, plan for failure. 4, don't let the tension go early. And 5, think about what sticks to you. When you speak, some quick thoughts on these. These are some thoughts that Katie and Jonica had on this last year as they were just glancing over these and seeing these bullet points and what those translated into e-learning for them. When you speak, I'm speaking a whole bunch of words. Your brain is taking those words and translating them into information that you can use. it's not storing all of the individual words in there. So when you tell a story, your brain is doing much more than just translating those words. It's sorting the information out into relatable bits of memory. So story is extremely strong and powerful when it comes to holding on to that. And at the risk of getting a little more long-winded, I'm not going to dive into bullet point 1 quite yet. I just want you guys to be able to see what we're going to cover. I don't know if any of you have grandparents that or parents who at some point were saying, I've got to go watch my stories. I can't hang out. I got to go watch my stories. This is so important, and story has always been important, even when we're at the lowest point. Stories is the core part of who we are. This theater, the Strand Theater, was built in 1932, right in the middle of the Great Depression. People didn't have money, people didn't have jobs, and yet they were building a theater. It had one screen, it seated 1,088 people. This information is from the Theater Historical Society, so if they got it wrong, then I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is accurate. This theater was filled at every showing during the Great Depression because people were looking for relief. They were looking for disconnect, and it was a great way to help them see what they were dealing on the big screen in another metaphor. The film industry was one of the few industries during the Great Depression that hardly suffered because they were telling the stories, helping people go on these adventures when they were stuck. And so people have always resonated with stories, and they're very powerful even when you're in a rough place. This, I wasn't able to find a more recent version of this, but I'm sure the data is accurate, if not more astounding now than it was then. The average person, the average adult, 18 plus, spent roughly 6 hours a day at the beginning of 2018 watching video. That's a combination of video on computers, on mobile, broadcast, whatever. They're watching video, moving pictures and speaking. That's nearly 6 hours a day. And that was back before a pandemic when we were like, what's 12 hours of watching TV? You know, like this is only getting bigger, I'm sure. People love stories. People love to disconnect. Although we say disconnect, but really what stories do is they connect all of us together. They help us all find one story that we can then have our own metaphors with, but we've all connected on that one story. Think about when the big movies came out, the Avengers. That was a huge thing. Every time one of those came out, suddenly people were gathering together and talking about it. When Star Wars came out, suddenly everybody's gathering together and talking about it. It's helping us connect through common stories and common lessons. Another thing that we talked about last year at this point is that I've heard that we're no longer in the information age, but rather in the conversation age. We've had access to information at our fingertips since the internet came out. Loads of information at our fingertips, but what we're looking for is conversation. What we're looking for is connection. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Instagram, all of this is to connect, tools used to connect, and that's the age that we're into. We want to relate, we want to belong, we want to be heard, we want to be valued, and stories can help us do that and help us create bonds. It just comes back to that stories are a communal currency of humanity. We pay huge bucks to see movies. I don't know what you guys did. The last movie that I remember paying for was Ford v Ferrari. I probably paid for movies more recently than that, but that's what I remember because I paid $11.50 for my seat. So much to see a movie.
And you gotta get the popcorn too.
I don't get popcorn because I'm cheap. Because I'm paying $11.50 for a movie. But yeah, they're expensive, and we do it because we value it. All right, so the first point. If you're going to tell a story, make it worthwhile. Don't let story become an afterthought. A common thing that we see as people are building e-learning or training is that you say, okay, here's my checklist. Here's my bullet points of things that I have to cover for my compliance training, for my this, for my that. And then I want to make it a story. So how do I just run you through the story of all these steps? And you can, I guess you could consider the story being, if I needed to learn how to leave this building, I could say, well, the story is that you stand up And then you walk to the door and you open the door and you walk to the next door and you go through. That's not necessarily a story. If you make the story your first thing and not an afterthought, it will help. People will remember the story easier than they remember specific data points. So make it a story that's worth remembering, and then the data points will fall into that story. Some of the most memorable teaching moments in school are when you are given a story to continue with. So like I said, when I was in school studying film, the stories were often a client comes to you. This is their business. This is their history. This is where they'd like to go. And now they're coming to you asking for you to make a film, a commercial or an ad or something that is going to make this adjustment to their story. And you can learn more about their backstory. Where are they coming from? What did they do before? What's their client base like? And you're gathering information to put together a story that will help you remember and present and continue to go. The story problems in math are more of a bad example, where we're like, here's the data points, and then we're just assigning story points to it. We need to know what happens when this object's going this way, this object's going this way. Let's make it a story and call them trains, Bad example. A better example is to actually make a story that fits and sticks. Stories help depict relevance. We had at ELBX Live 2019 a fantastic speaker with Hadiya Nuruddin, and she said this: when stories stick to you, you may have actually learned something. Something to think about that. If you remember something, if there's a story that is sticking to you, there's a good chance you learned something in that story. Whether it was a story that was told to you or whether it's a story from your own life and you go, oh, I remember this happened. I remember this happened, this happened. This was a great story. Let me tell you the story. It's probably because you learned something. You learned a little piece of something along in there, and the story is sticking to you. So let's talk about story. I'm glancing at the questions. I don't think we have any yet. I'm going to really need you guys to be fast on the fingers in a couple seconds because we're going to dive into Star Wars. This is a basic story arc. The length across the bottom is the left and right axis is the length of the story, time as it moves on. The up and down is the tension in the story. So at the beginning, low tension, you're meeting the characters, you're having your exposition. Then as you're rising action, you're increasing in tension, you get your climax, and it drops and you have a resolution. Or plot mountain, says somebody in the audience. Yes, I think that's great. I see another question from someone. Are there any storytelling scripts someone can follow to tell a story? That's exactly what we're going to cover here next. This is a very simple plot mountain. Here's a slightly more complex plot mountain. And we're gonna stay on this slide for a little bit and talk about Star Wars. Okay. What's more accurate about this is you see a rise and a drop in tension. A good story is going to have lots of rises and drops, especially along this line. You guys can see my mouse, right?
I believe so. I can see it.
Okay. So along this line, you're going to have a lot of micro little increase in tension, drop in tension, increase in tension, drop in tension, increase, drop, increase, all the way up until that midpoint. And what this has a little bit wrong, in my opinion, this particular chart, is I believe that the climax should be higher than the midpoint when it comes to tension. But I guess it depends on the story, what you want to do. Okay, so to help you guys map this out and see how any story fits this, we're going to apply Star Wars to this chart, or whichever direction it is. I might be above it. So this chart, okay? We're going to try to identify where in Star Wars all of these points are. So please be quick on your fingers, and Stephanie's going to do her best. So the first thing I'm going to ask you guys is the inciting incident. What do you think the inciting incident is? And while you're typing that and thinking about that, I'm going to tell you what the starting point is. So Star Wars starts with that huge scroll, right? The world is the empire's in unrest or whatever, I don't remember. And then suddenly this huge Star Destroyer flies over and it's under attack. And you go in and you see C-3PO and R2-D2 running away. You meet Darth Vader. You meet Princess Leia. They eject. They fly out. Those gunner guys are like, wait, don't shoot that pod because it's empty and we're low on laser bolts. They didn't actually say that, but I still don't understand why they didn't just shoot it. I mean, anyway, so it goes down, lands on Tatooine. They jump out. They run around, get captured by Jawas, and then they're sold to Owen Lars and his nephew Luke. So that's generally the start of Star Wars. We've now met everybody. So your general exposition is done. You've met Darth Vader, you've met Princess Leia, you've met the 2 droids, and you've met Luke. What is the inciting incident?
We've got a couple theories in the
Uh-huh.
comments. So one of them is the Imperial fleet has grown and is threatening the universe. Another theory is when Luke meets old Ben and gets his father's lightsaber. Oh wow, we have a lot of theories. Luke seeing the message from Princess Leia, Luke's family being killed, plans to the death. I mean, I think we're just doing.
Yeah, so we're getting a lot of ideas. What we're looking for, because the main character in the 1977 Star Wars is Luke Skywalker. So we're looking for his story. When is his regular life disrupted? That's what you're looking for, and you're going to think about this as well in your training. When is my employee, my worker, whoever, my learner's life disrupted by what I'm trying to train them? And when Luke's life was disrupted, it looks like Walt got it right, is when Luke sees the message from the princess. His regular old life is cleaning up these stinking droids that his dumb uncle bought when he just wanted to go to Dashi Station and buy some power converters. He's cleaning it, and then out comes the princess. Help me, Obi-Wan, you're my only hope. And he's like, oh my gosh, this is totally different. This is throwing me out of norm. And then R2 runs away, and he has to go chase him. He finds Obi-Wan, and Obi-Wan's like, well, the princess has called us to go and do this, so let's go. And Luke's like, I can't do that. I've got my regular life. I don't want to do this. I'm refusing the call to go out. And that's when something happens, and people have mentioned this, the death of his family, of his aunt and uncle. He goes back, he's denying everything, and he crosses that threshold, overcomes the first obstacle right here, this 3rd point, when he comes back to Ben, who's at the Jawa's death site, and he says, I want to join the rebellion and become a Jedi like my father before me. That's when his life's been disrupted, and he has chosen to go on this adventure. You can do that with other movies too. Loads of any other story. There's going to be some point where they're in denial, and then they say, okay, nope, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go cross over that threshold. I'm going to go and make that decision. And that's when Luke does it. So then as we increase to the midpoint, there's loads of different challenges, right? So they get to Mos Eisley, and suddenly there's stormtroopers, and oh my gosh, the stormtroopers are going to catch him. And Obi-Wan's like, these are all the droids you're looking for. And they come back, and the tension comes back down. Okay, we made it. And then they go into the bar, and that alien is pushing Luke around, and he pulls out a gun, and Obi-Wan cuts his arm off. The tension's really high, and then, oh my gosh, okay, they made it. They're okay. And then they go to meet Han and Chewie, and they're like, oh, we're going to be really expensive. You really want us to go? And Luke's like, we don't have enough money for this. And Obi-Wan's like, okay, we'll pay half here and half there. And oh, okay. And then they get to the Millennium Falcon, and there's stormtroopers there, and there's a gunfight, and they ride. So all of this is happening along this line. All of these little micro challenges, these micro situations. I have, where is my note? These peaks and valleys challenges. Son of a gun. It must be on my next slide. But these are scenarios. Oh, there it is. Yeah, each one of these is a scenario that they are overcoming with increased tension each time. So we are moving past. So coming up to this midpoint, you'll see that there's a big drop. I want to talk about the 3-act structure really quick too. So these first 3 points would be like the first act. Between this point and this point would be the second act, and then this to the end is the third act. Your first act is typically setting up, and when he chooses to go on the adventure, after he goes on the adventure, you've entered the second act, where they're going to be going through the majority of the movie. Lots of chunks. But 9 times out of 10, your second act ends with something very, very sad, with some sort of a failure, with some sort of we made an attempt and we didn't succeed. So in Star Wars, 1977 Star Wars, what is the end of the second act? They had this huge rise in tension, and then something happens that the tension goes away, but then something sad happens, or something doesn't work out the way. They fail in one way or another. What do you guys think that would be in the 1977 Star Wars? Okay, the very first. Yeah, they're coming up like crazy.
Say it? Yeah, they're coming in fast. We have a lot of people saying Obi-Wan's death. Other people saying when Alderaan is blown up. a lot of votes for Obi-Wan's death.
Yes. So what I'm looking for is Obi-Wan. I would say that the destruction of Alderaan is another one of those spikes because our main character, remember, is Luke Skywalker in this one. And Alderaan wasn't a big deal for him. But Ben dying, old Ben, Obi-Wan Kenobi dying is way bad. But the tension goes away because they do escape from the Death Star, right? So the tension drops, they get away, they're getting tracked by the Death Star, and so the tension is slowly increasing. But now they have another obstacle, they have another decision. It's their final rise up. It's the all or nothing, which is why I think the climax tension should be the highest on this chart. What is the climax of this movie? What is the final conflict of Star Wars?
All right, I think that everyone is probably going to get this one. Got a lot of comments coming in about blowing up the Death Star.
That's right. That whole huge battle of the Death Star, and even then you can see the story arc, right? Because the Y-wings fly in, Gold Leader comes in, fires the torpedoes, and he misses. It impacts on the surface. It doesn't actually go in. So you've got that rise and fall, like, oh my gosh, it didn't work. A failure, even in line there. And yet they do destroy it. And then you come down and you can relax and the tension goes away and everybody except the Wookiee for some reason gets a medal, right? And that's the end of the movie. And that movie was so successful and is still successful. They're still making Star Wars because that one nailed it. That one followed this line and told a story that would be remembered, that was memorable. Story arc focuses on your main character, like I said, Luke Skywalker. Now you may be saying, hey, wait a second. What about movies like Lord of the Rings, where there's 8 characters? I would say 9, but Boromir dies like quick. So, what about these movies that have lots of stories? That's great. Each one of them follows their own arc. So you're having these same things, but they're all kind of split, happening separately. And they'll normally all happen in tandem so that you're meeting the criteria at the same time as you're watching the film. When you are making stories for e-learning, your main character is your learner. You need to remember that your main character is your learner. You're trying to make your learner go on the path and have this experience so that it is a memorable one. There's lots of peaks and valleys, like I said, challenges to overcome or lose at. Each one is a scenario. So the whole point of these elements is, the reason I'm telling you about these elements is because these are the elements. This is the framework for a good story. So don't count them out. Now I'm going to show you an e-learning example. We did a course with Metamythic called SIP Defender. This won a Gold Brandon Hall Award. This is what you see at the beginning. You see, just like in Star Wars, an introduction to the bad guys, like you see with Darth Vader coming onto the ship. These are some of the bad guys. Some of the robots is what we decided to personify these as, that are going to come and attack your database. So this is database defense and things like that, security. You meet the characters, you meet the good guys, you meet the bad guys, you meet the influencers, and you have this call to adventure that, hey, we need someone to take over this facility, this database, and protect it. And you are that person. Also, you know about each of these smaller bad guys, but throughout the course, you are being shown and told about this one epic bad guy who's on his way to you. So everything you're doing is preparing you for that. So if you've seen the Avengers, it's like Thanos, right? This big epic bad guy that suddenly starts showing up in the after credits movies throughout every one of these, what is it now, 3004 Avenger movies that have come out, that are preparing you for something big. So in this one, we're saying, look, there's all these bad guys that are going to be attacking you, but something big is coming, and you need to prepare for that. And you're going to have lots of these practice battles with these smaller ones. And then each module had a quiz of sorts, but it's set up like a battle, like a fight, like someone is coming and they're trying to intrude on your database. And you have to have a small battle that is that rising action of the story. You're saying, okay, someone's trying to attack. This one says, I'm sorry, Dave, I can't let you in without proper access, and how are you helping to defend your it looks like a power station, but how are you defending your database? How are you doing these things? And having these little battles, and there are opportunities to fail. It's important that you're asking critical thinking questions of the learner to help them engage and feel like they're participating, not just watching. How many of us have taken training? I know I did with a certain youth organization where you're just watching a bunch of movies and then they ask you a quiz at the end. And I'm not participating, I'm just watching, right? Asking critical questions along the line of your learner helps them engage and feel like they're participating. This kind of choose your own adventure thing is used pretty often, but we find that if we just have a plain old choose your own adventure, some people will answer incorrectly just to see what will happen. Jonica last year mentioned a course that she saw. I don't remember if she took it or had helped build it, but after every quiz that you answered correctly, there was a morbid curiosity button that you could click, and it would show you what had happened if you clicked incorrectly. So then you're able to learn everything, and you're choosing to learn that and find out what would happen if something went wrong. What would happen if I chose in this adventure the incorrect pathway? So that's the first bullet point. Second one, tell a good story. Dan Dillenbaugh, the name that's here, and Richard Vass, who's our VP of Customer Success, and I believe he's on this session with us right now. They gave a similar presentation to this about story, and I'll mention more of their presentation later as well. But they loved talking about Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, which is essentially the same thing we're talking about today. And trying to find stories out there, figure out what story to tell that will meet Joseph Campbell's hero's journey criteria, but stick with your learner and apply. And this is what Dan said. What you're looking for in a story is anything that really moves people and compels them. I'm looking for something compelling. Now, how do you choose that story? How do you come up with that story? We'll dive into that here. Hadiya Nuruddin, who I mentioned earlier, she spoke at ELBX 2018, I don't remember. But she said, here's what she likes to do. She likes to pull stories from her life. That way she's making sure she's not stealing any copywritten material. She's going to take a story from her life. How does she pick what story to take and mold into an e-learning kind of thing? For one, all of the stories that she remembers, she tries to clarify the lesson. She asks, how did that make me feel? Find the emotion in the story and draw empathy from the audience. So you want the audience, whoever you're telling the story to or whoever is experiencing the story, they need to connect with it. They need to have empathy with it. The second thing is they need to look for that lesson throughout the story. So clarify, from this, I experienced this lesson. This is the lesson I got, but now I need to figure out where in that story I can point to that lesson. What do I know is true about this? She mentioned the honest reflection is key, and you need to accept that you only know your experience in your own life, in your own stories. I don't know what my wife is thinking when I'm telling these stories about me being dumb to her. I just know my side. And sometimes that makes it funnier, because if I tell my own side and anybody else knows my wife and knows what she's likely thinking, they see how stupid I am. The last one is support the lesson. You need to ask yourself, how do I know this is true? Where am I inferring? Maybe this small story, I'm inferring data from another story without thinking about it. How do I know this point of the story is true? And remember that storytelling is about you, but not for you. Whatever stories you're telling, they're not about you. They're for your learner. They're for whoever's hearing. And you want to follow that narrative arc to show change. So that's the other thing I was going to talk about with the story arc, is that Luke changes, right? Throughout the story of Star Wars, from the moment he says, I want to join the rebellion and become a Jedi like my father, he begins to change. He stops being the whiny farm boy that wanted to go to Tashi Station and buy some power converters, and instead becomes this pilot for a rebellion fighting against the Death Star, a terrifying thing, fight against the Empire, right? And that's a change in his character that happens throughout. Okay, we're a little more than halfway through. I might have to start talking faster. I don't remember. No, actually, we're doing good. We're doing good. Okay. This bullet point, plan for failure. Key points in Star Wars are times when they fail. Remember the trash compactor? We all thought that they were going to fail. They almost got squished to death before R2 found the trash compactor to shut off. Failure is an extremely important part of the story. There has to be conflict, and sometimes you have to lose. Obi-Wan dies, right? Luke's aunt and uncle, they die. Alderaan gets destroyed, right? There are failures along the way. And you have to have that conflict. You have to have that. At this point, a year ago, Katie and Jonica also brought up a message from David Thornburg, who writes about learning spaces. He says, we learn in 3, and now he's since added four different ways. There's the campfire, the watering hole, the cave, and then life or over the mountain. So the campfire is like one to many. You gather around the campfire, and I'm going to tell you a story, and we're all going to learn communally. Okay, the next one is the watering hole, peer-to-peer. It's where I walk up to one person, and we have an exchange of ideas and an exchange of information. The last one, or the third one, is the cave, where you're able to go into a secluded spot and have a conversation with yourself. What did I learn today? How does this apply to me? Time for me to digest and pull that information all together. And then the last one is life, or over the mountain, which they added because they realized it's so important to be able to go and experiment and experience and fail. Failure is a part of the process. And some of the best stories are those that are about failures, not success. Think about that one. We love the hero's journey because the hero wins, but some of the best stories are about failures. Some of the stories that are the most memorable are about those that are about a failure. I also want to point out that storytelling can touch on all of these points, not just life or over the mountain. It can cover the campfire, the watering hole, the cave, etc. In an e-learning scenario, even that cave part. So if you want to cover the cave part in e-learning, you can, as a part of the story, allow them to find ways to implement what they've learned in their daily work. We've seen this. Our custom team did something back in 2019, I think, for a large financial company, and they had that return to cave where they said, fill out this form about what you've learned. What things from what you learned in this last chapter could you apply to your current work? And when they finished filling that out, there was a print button, and it would print out, and they could have that reflection that they themselves had typed up. Nothing that the course had given them, but that they as an individual had typed up and said, these are the changes I'm going to make. These are the differences I'm going to make in my daily work. And then they could put it up on their wall or wherever, throw it in a drawer. I don't know, but they did it. That's the important part. Coming back to failure, this is a slide from Richard Vass and Dan Dellenbaugh's slide. This is the exact same thing. This is the exact same thing as a story arc. They were talking about Rocky. So they organized theirs to look like Rocky. So there's an ordinary world where there's a regular life, or like in Star Wars, Luke's just working on a moisture farm. There's that call to adventure. The princess pops out, refusal of the call. Oh, no, I can't do that. I gotta work with my uncle. Meeting the mentor, like Obi-Wan, then making that decision. I'm going to cross the threshold. I'm going to go and actually go and do this thing. There's all kinds of tests, allies, enemies, your approach, your ordeal, death. This is when Obi-Wan dies. This is when he meets up with the rebels, your reward, seizing the sword, the road back, flying out to fight the Death Star. Han and Chewie come back, even though they said they weren't going to help fight, and then they win and they return with the elixir or whatever. This is all Joseph Campbell's thing. So I want to walk through this whole thing the way Richard did about a course. And I also want to quote Richard. When you're applying this to your course and you're looking for a way to fit your story together and you're trying to make them fit into this pattern, Richard says, there will be an ordeal some point along the line where you find out the problem. And that problem is one of the key learning objectives for the course. Then the reward isn't, in this case, beating up a Russian boxer. Again, he's talking about Rocky. But it might be challenging the general manager to change his thinking, right? That's a crazy challenge. That's something that you go, okay, we're presenting you this large challenge that you need to prepare for, and you're trying to figure out how you're going to get him to change that thinking. Our custom team followed this methodology in a hotel hospitality training they did, where they followed each of these steps. So at the beginning, they're setting the scene, your character. you are a hospitality manager that is going to be flying on a trip to some fancy place, and you're going to be getting there and fixing something and getting the general manager of this hotel you're headed to change his thinking on something. So you get the assignment, you get on the plane to fly to Europe. And while you're on the plane, you're reading up on the dossier of the mission, you get an email or a phone call from the mentor that says, hey, thanks for going and doing this. This is what I want you to be able to do. Do you have any questions? You could put like a chat bot in there or something like that to say, fill in the details on what you need to know. Then you get off the plane, you meet the mentor in person. You could, if you wanted to. Then you have loads of challenges, like you're going and meeting different members of the staff in the hotel, and you're meeting these challenges and realigning them to meet the hotel's standards or the franchise's standards. And then ultimately, at the very end, you have a poker game with the general manager against the general manager, right? And the poker game is really just a quiz, right? It's just a knowledge check. But it feels like you're having that boss fight. You're fighting, you're having that game with that general manager at the end after you've shared all of this data and this information. He changes his mind. You get to fly home and read emails and maybe take a couple more quizzes, and then you're certified. But you've done this story. You've said, oh my gosh, I had this experience, and this is something really great. The hero's journey falls into this story arc the same. They're just illustrated differently. I've got about 15 minutes left, and I don't remember what bullet point I'm on. Does anybody have any questions while I take a drink of water?
You are just too good at this presentation. No one has any questions. Or they actually just left and are watching Star Wars.
No disagreements either. Okay, that's good. That's good. All right, so let's talk about tension. Don't let the tension go early. Tension is what drives a story. Tension is what keeps people glued to their seat. Think about the last ghost story you heard, right? Sitting around a campfire, people just leaning in, being like, oh my gosh, what happened next? Oh my gosh, what happened next? That tension is what keeps them there. And a lot of the time in a ghost story, the way you're keeping that tension is you're whispering and you're telling parts of the story just like this, right? And learn more about what's happening. And you're giving that information in such a way that they want to pay attention, even if it's not information that's interesting, right? So that's just something to consider. I'm not going to tell a ghost story. I thought I was going to, but I'm not going to. You will lose your learners if you drop the tension super early. Look at where this climax point is. It's towards the end, right? It's not way up here. If your climax happens right at the beginning and the rest of your movie is all resolution, it's terrible. So good examples are like that SIP Defender course I told you about, where you know there's something coming. So no matter what, throughout the course, you're going, oh my gosh, something big is coming, a large challenge I'm going to have to prepare for. Another great example, if any of you have read or seen the movie Ender's Game, there's always this looming something is coming. Something is happening, right? It's building. You always know there's something out there that's coming. And Ender's Game even went to the point, again, big spoilers here. But in Ender's Game, they even went to the point where you overcome a challenge, and then after they overcome the challenge, they then tell you that was the climax. You didn't even know that was the climax when you were going over it, but you were so invested, you know? So that's an interesting one. And another one is Star Wars. As soon as they blow up the Death Star, they fly back, they sing a great song, they get medals, and it's over. They are not wasting time around in the resolution. They're not tying up all these knots. They told you the story. They had the big climactic end. It's over. They jump to it. Some not so good examples. Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. Okay? If you are watching this movie or reading this book, in and of itself, not as a part of the whole trilogy, but just in and of itself, in the movie, it's a 3-hour movie, there's more than 35 minutes after the ring is destroyed and the war ends before the movie actually ends. 35 minutes after that big climactic moment where the tension is gone and you're just like, well, I'm out of popcorn, so I guess I'll watch some stuff, right? On the aspect of that film, it is so long. My wife hates watching Return of the King because of the amount of time that is in the resolution stage is so long. If you take it into, yes, I see somebody commenting. I remember the audience's reaction. I could hear him groaning. If you take it as a 9-hour film, if you put all of them together, then 35 minutes is nothing compared to that 9 hours. But if you put it into that other one. So now think about that. Excuse me. Think about that in the context of our courses. How often do we ramble on and on and on without any tension? How can we hold on to some of that tension? Okay. I would love to hear some of your guys' thoughts on how to hold on to tension in an e-learning course. How do you hold on to your learners' tension? While that's happening, I'm going to take a look at some of these questions. Unless Steph, actually, would you mind asking some of these questions? I think I'm out of water.
All right. Well, one of the questions is what we have just challenged the audience, which was exactly how do you hold that tension in an e-learning course? So we'll get some audience submissions and talk about those. And then we did have a comment that The Undoing is a really great example of this story arc. I haven't watched The Undoing yet, but I know it's very popular right now. So maybe that'll be my homework assignment.
Yeah.
And then here's a good one. How to convince a client if they think that a story is not like a serious way to do e-learning. Are there any arguments that you could give to show them that storytelling can be used as serious e-learning?
Sure. For one, you can ask them if they remember their last e-learning course better than they remember the 1977 Star Wars that came out 40 years ago. So that's one thing. But the other thing is there's going to be a slide here towards the end that's going to have a page of sources from more credible people than me.
Yes, we have lots of resources for you all.
And I'd love for you to be able to take a look at those and use those in your argument. So hopefully that helps to answer your question.
Oh, here we've got a good suggestion for holding tension throughout is using a meter or a graph that shows progress as the learner makes choices. They don't get the max score until they get to the end of the course. That's one option.
It's a good mix of gamification in there too.
Yes. Yeah, we had another person asking in the hotel example, they said the end quiz at the end with the poker game sounds a bit like gamification. So yeah,
gamification is great. I think there's what we find as we're working on e-learning is that gamification sometimes gets misunderstood and underutilized. Gamification doesn't necessarily mean adding a game. Gamification means making the entire experience something that you want to play, that you want to try to trick, that you want to participate in, right? So I remember as a kid always looking forward to test study day, right? The day before a test, because the teacher was going to throw Jeopardy up on the screen and we'd be able to play a game, and that was great. But it didn't make the entire learning experience gamified. They just added a game before the test. Another way to do gamification, our LMS, our Rockstar LMS, has gamification options where you get more points based on more courses that you take. So it's pulling a game and turning the entire learning experience into gamification. But yeah, I mean, what you're talking about, because a lot of video gamers out there are playing a game because they want the story. They want an interactive story. And so adding a gaming mechanic like a poker game at the end of a story is still gamification, because they're going to want to take that course and learn what they can to beat that manager at the end of the poker game.
Yeah, definitely. We're getting some suggestions also for surprise scenarios to solve when the learners aren't expecting it. So something similar to like a real world emergency that comes up, or giving them the story or the problem at the beginning of the course, then stopping and then bringing it back at the end. Some other ways to get the tension in there.
That's a great one, especially if you can get them invested in the story first, which is, again, thinking more about that empathy like Hadia Nuruddin mentioned. If you can get them where they're empathizing with whatever character that you're having, then they'll hold on to that. They'll hold on to that.
Yep.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to plug ahead if that's okay with you guys. We might have more time for examples at the end, which we're very close to, I promise. Think about what sticks to you. All of us are humans. We're all people. We have fights and disagreements, and we say terrible things to each other on social media. But we're all people. We're all humans. And there's a dang good chance that if something sticks to you, it's going to stick to somebody else as well. Your story isn't as important as the learner's story. Don't forget that we think in metaphors, and so your story is merely a metaphor for their story. But the fact of the matter is that you are similar enough to other people that there's a good chance your story will metaphorically tie to somebody else. So don't discount stories that you come up with, because your stories are just as good as anybody else's. You also want to think about the stories that you want to tell, and then figure out how to tell them in a way that is interesting. So have you guys ever had the experience where you get a really cool story that you think is really cool and you go and you tell it to someone and they just don't care? That's the freaking worst, right? It's the best though when you tell a story and the other person is reacting along with you. Oh my gosh, no way that happened too. Oh no, then that happened. Tell me more, That's the best. And those are the kind of stories that you want to tell. And again, reiterating that you have these stories. You don't have to rewrite Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or the Avengers or anything. Just tell your stories. Don't worry too much about retelling or reskinning something. We are in the conversation age. We want to relate with each other. We want to hear and tell our stories. Stories will help us relate. This last quote from Hadiya Nuruddin: everything that you've experienced shaped who you are. And there's many, many people you don't even know who would love to be able to have the experiences that you have. So use those stories, right? And as you do that, you'll become an e-learning rock star. So if you are going to, if this adventure that we've just been on for the last 53 minutes has been your story arc, right? Now's the time when you've won. We're coming back to that elixir. You're returning with an elixir. What's your takeaway? It's that telling stories is going to make you into an e-learning rock star. Okay, this is what I want to share. And so here's that data, those links. If you guys want to take a screenshot, and I'm sure we can probably pass a PDF out to anybody that wants to. And it wouldn't be. I would probably be remiss if I didn't mention that our team is filled with a lot of expert storytellers, and that if you need help, you should feel more than welcome to reach out to us on the community. If you want to go to the eLearning Brothers community, you can access that. It's new, and I don't necessarily remember the link. So Stephanie, if you can get that in the chat. I think it's
rockstars.elearningbrothers.com.
Okay. Yeah. Rockstar or rockstars?
Rockstars plural, because we're all rock stars.
Okay. My brain is fried.
I remember it.
Door.
I will put the link in the chat for everyone.
Yes, please do. So you can reach out to us there. You can post something there. You can also send, I'll put this up on the screen. You can send us an email at info@elearningbrothers.com. You can learn more about our custom team at elearningbrothers.com as well. I see a couple things flagged. And Richard Vass, if you're still on here, I would love to hear any thoughts that you might have that you think I totally spaced over. And we'll take the last 6 minutes for questions and whatever Rich brings up.
All right, well, we'll give Rich a minute to think of all his critiques of your presentation. And in the meantime, I think we've got a great question here. How much does storytelling depend on having expensive graphic design and multimedia production? What if you don't have those resources to dress up the story? Can you still tell a good, engaging story in your e-learning?
I think so. One of my favorite stories from my childhood, and that I still tell to my son and purchased as well, is the story of Rikki Tikki Tavi. I don't know if any of you know from that. It's one of the small stories from the Jungle Book. It's been told in a lot of different ways, and been told. My favorite one is I think it was a BBC animation of it, and it's not great animation, right? It is not phenomenal. It's good enough, but the story keeps me pinned, even as an adult. When my son's like, I want to watch Rikki Tikki, I'm like, I got 20 minutes. Let's do this. I'm ready to watch it. It doesn't have to look great. Also, think about this last story, maybe a story you told to someone over Thanksgiving break. Did you have flashcards? Did you hold up pictures? Did you show them a movie? Or did you just tell them? A good story, if it follows the right principles, is good enough without it looking super flashy.
We had someone who wanted a little refresher on the Campfire Watering Hole Cave. Do you remember who said that. Who made that metaphor? I think
Probably David
here,
Thornburg.
I'm going to share a link to PDF about that in the chat.
Yes, so that's David Thornburg talking about learning spaces. There's a campfire, watering hole, the cave, and then life or over the mountain.
Yes, and then let's see, there was one last question. All right, so if you are limited in time, like your learners don't have a lot of time to be sitting through a long e-learning course, how can you keep the storytelling short and sweet? So you can fit it in maybe like micro-learning.
Yeah. So I want to talk about that as well. So the story arc is split into that 3-act structure. I don't have my slides properly labeled, so I have to kind of like bounce around until I find the right one. Remember that these are in a 3-act structure. And Lord of the Rings is a good example where they split all 3 acts into separate books, right? If you take the first act from start to the first obstacle and you put that as just the Fellowship of the Ring, when did Frodo, who is the main character for all intents and purposes, decide to cross that threshold? Any thoughts? Any thoughts on that from the audience? I'll just tell you because I watched the movie last night. Frodo decides he's going to leave the Fellowship and go by himself because it will be safer for everybody, and it will be better that he's sneaking around by himself than with other people. And that's when he crosses the threshold. And then what happens? The movie ends. And to a 13-year-old watching that in the movie theater without any context, that was so bad for me. Oh, I was so mad that it just ended when he just made a big decision, right? So you can easily split your learning into at least 3 parts with your first act, second act, and third act. And also don't forget that all of the obstacles, all of the scenarios along that obstacle line, getting stuck in the trash compactor, breaking the princess out, getting sucked in by the Death Star, Obi-Wan fighting Darth Vader, all of those were micro scenarios. And those can all be micro courses if you want as well. That's just one way to do it. I'm sure there's other ways you could do it as well.
Yep. And then Rich did give us a follow-up comment kind of related to that. If you can even just incorporate one of the elements, even just one moment of tension. So if you don't have seat time for like a long drawn-out storytelling arc, if you can get at least one moment of tension in there, more engaging than dry old e-learning.
Yeah, that's true. We talk about a lot of grand stuff. The SIP Defender course was huge. The hotel hospitality course was huge. It was a big deal. But sometimes you got to make baby steps. And if you're going from reading a whole bunch of stuff and then taking your certification quiz to adding tension somehow, holy cow, what a difference that's going to make. And then you can make the next step later. Baby steps. I think it was from, what was it? Frozen 2. I have children. I probably would have seen it.
We didn't put that on the spoilers list.
I know, I'm sorry.
You can't say anything
but there's a quote in Frozen 2 where she says, just take the next right step, right? You don't have to know how to get all the way there. Just need to know how to take the next right step. Thanks, Disney. Actually, other than Lord of the Rings, is this whole thing brought to you by Disney? I don't even know anymore. I've quoted a lot of movies that are owned by Disney. All right. Oh, and somebody quoted, what about Bob? That's right. Baby steps. Baby steps onto the windowsill. Baby steps off of the windowsill. All right. That's all. That's all I had to say. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
The recording will be sent to you. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.